some more guys joining in right now. We just have 38 odd. So we are now right now at 3:28. Maybe a couple of minutes from now, and we should be on. It's 15:29 by my watch in India. So maybe a couple of minutes, Peter.
Yeah, no worries.
Thank you. All campus directors, please put a message in your groups so that people can join immediately. All campus director out here.
Done. We are calling them one by one.
Please put the message. All campus directors, please, fast.
We have done. We have called them again just now.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, it's an absolute pleasure for us, all of us, to be here today from all IIHM India campuses to welcome Professor Peter Jones, who's Dean of eHotelier Academy. He is the visiting professor at the University of Derby and University of West London. Recently, he's been awarded the Doctor of Science from that university. He was made the Order of the British Empire for his services to the hospitality industry. And today, he's going to speak to us on strategies for effective online teaching and learning. He's a legend, and today he'll be talking only to IIHM faculties across our India campuses and share what goes behind in making a successful online class that students understand sitting different parts of the country. Now, before I call in Professor Peter Jones, I'd like to invite our Chairman and CEO, Dr. Suborna Bose, on the screen. Over to you, sir.
Yeah, very good afternoon, everybody, ladies and gentlemen, from all over the 8 campus of IIHM and as well as in IAM, Calcutta and Guwahati as well. So faculty from 10 campuses joining in, a couple of friends as well. We have got also all the campus directors with us and other directors. So yes, because after the lockdown, we all went into the online teaching, but almost like thrown into the new space of the online teaching. And I think we did a remarkable job within 48 hours to get ourselves into the online teaching mode. But however, we all know that there are a lot of elements which actually makes the online teaching much more engaging, much more interesting, and much more productive. I think the stickiness is very important. The students should really engage and be in the class, and strategies are quite different from a physical classroom where we are quite used to teaching all our life. So from IHM, this is our initiative to get some real good educationists from all over the world and India, of course, come and speak to all our teachers and educators about how we can really refine and make our online delivery more engaging, more customer focused, and more student friendly. Obviously, at some point of time, there has to be some digital fatigue. So to avoid that digital fatigue, we need to do a lot of things. So this is the first of our series of like 6 lectures on the online teaching learning strategies for effective teaching learning strategies. And we have got with us a very good friend, old friend, and also one of our founder member of the International Hospitality Council Foundation in London, Peter Jones, Professor Peter Jones. He had also served as the director of the very famous Blue Mountain Hospitality School in Australia for a number of years, and is a very reputed educationist and educational exponent. So I can't really get a better person than Peter Jones to open this 6 series lecture on effective online teaching and learning strategy for the students of IIHM and IAM. And I'm very grateful and thankful to Peter for his time. And thanks, Peter, for being with us. And thank you very much from the entire community of IHM and ISC for being with us today. We're all yours right now. We have got 140 people in the Zoom, and possibly another 40-50 joining in. Rupa Datta, who is the academic director of our campuses, joins in as your moderator. For any questions, you can put on the chat box, and Rupa will select the question and will ask on your behalf to Professor Jones. That will make the little more structured than 140 people asking 140 questions. So all the very best to everybody. Have a coffee, relax. If you are in a college or even in your IIHM campus or in your bedroom from work from home. So don't worry, we are going to have a lovely, exciting next 45-60 minutes of time with Professor Peter Jones. Over to Peter. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Suburnu. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm not sure I want to be called a legend. That rather implies that I'm old, and anyway, perhaps not enough of that. What I would like to do is use this as a workshop. So it's not really a lecture from me. What I'm going to try and do is present to you a number of different points that I think we need now to address. The whole object of the exercise is not for me to tell you what to do, but it's to pose a number of questions to ask you to think about how you're going to move forward. So it's more challenging, perhaps, rather than directive. So I'm not suggesting to you that these are solutions. What I'm suggesting to you is that there are a number of things that you need to consider that in themselves will help you to find solutions, okay? So I'd like to start off by something which is a bit of an overview about where I think hospitality education is at the moment in a general sense. First of all, we have to recognize that this pandemic has caused massive disruption in terms of not the whole, everybody in the whole world, but of course that disruption has an equal impact in terms of how we as hospitality educators have been used to delivering and to recognizing what we're doing. Now that disruption has also forced and acted as a catalyst for huge acceleration and change. And you've done that yourselves. Suborno just mentioned, of course, that you moved a lot of your materials online within the space of 48 hours. That may previously, you may have been working towards that goal, but it may have been 3 years down the track. All of a sudden you did it in 48 hours. So I think the time now is to say, okay, we've done that. We've got an element of that in place, but is it right? Is it working? Is what we've done merely translating what we were doing before and trying to put it into an online environment? Now, what I'm suggesting is that we need to be a bit more fundamental than that, because I suggest that a lot of what we were previously used to doing and what would have formed the basis of the core of our curriculum within hospitality education has got to be rethought through. And I think I'm going to give you some words now, which I think it's almost a sequence of activities that I would like you to start to think about. And the first of those is we do need to rethink not just our curriculum, but also our model of delivery. And we've got to, in rethinking that, we then are in the process of re-engineering the curriculum and the delivery structure. And that involves us really almost to reset. So don't assume that what you were doing in the past and now you've moved online is going to be valid into the future. It needs to be re-looked at and rethought through. Because what we've got to be ensured of is that what we're doing is relevant to our students, relevant to us, and most importantly, relevant to the industry and the future of the industry. And I can give you some examples where I think some of the things that we've been used to doing in the past will largely be irrelevant. For example, some of the economic models that we've used in the past are likely to be fractured, broken, and we need to rethink new economic models. So some of the things that we've been used to teaching and would have used it as the basis of our teaching, actually in themselves are probably now flawed. So they need to be thought through as well. But it gives us a fantastic opportunity to do all those things. So if I just repeat those key words, I think you need to rethink the curriculum and your delivery strategies. I think you need to think about, when you're doing that, how am I going to re-engineer these things? Because I don't see these as being a short-term blip. I see them as being an opportunity to actually re-engineer what we're delivering to ensure that it's relevant for the future. And that means that we have to reset, if you like, most of our models. But in doing that, we have a huge opportunity to be creative, to be innovative in terms of what we're doing and how we do it, but also it needs to be resilient. It needs to be a resilient model that's going to stand buffeting, if you like, stand a little bit of the test of time, but it also needs to be resilient in the context of where it goes for the industry and for the students. Coming back to some extent to the word relevance as well. And I think the way that that can happen best is through collaboration and cooperation. I think I see, I mean, in your context, there's a lot of you anyway, so you have plenty of opportunity for that collaboration and cooperation. But I see the problem often is that when institutions think that they have a solution, they go alone with that solution, and actually it isn't a solution in itself. So the more one can cooperate, the more one can share experiences, the more one can share actually ideas and creativity, the better it's going to be for the benefit of hospitality education overall. Because what we're trying to achieve, I would suggest, is a form of blended learning. We need to use all the tools and techniques that are open to us to ensure that we can engage properly with our students in the future. In the past, it's been relatively straightforward. The student comes in, you see them, it's a face-to-face delivery, you can gauge their reactions, you can gauge their sentiments, you can gauge their responses, you actually have a direct interaction with those students. That is likely to be, certainly for the foreseeable future, not a practical way of actually thinking about delivery. So we've got to engage them, but we've got to engage them on a whole raft of different levels, in a whole raft of different ways that previously we wouldn't necessarily have thought about. And that engagement has actually got to be beyond knowledge. It's got to be beyond just giving them material and saying, learn that, I'll test you on it, and then we'll see whether you're good enough or otherwise. I think the whole rationale for engaging with them in a variety of different ways is that we need to try and stimulate them to learn and move away from the notion that they will come to us and we will teach them. So the stimulation of getting them to learn in a whole variety of different ways is our responsibility as educators. But that's where we've got to be heading to, that we've got to be moving from teaching into much more of a focus about learning and how they will learn, not only now, but how they will learn in the future. Recognizing, of course, that we're talking about generations, Gen Z, Y, whatever you want to call them, who are much more digitally aware. And because they're digitally aware, they're using digital platforms all the time. But it's not just the digital platform that's important to consider. We need to think about how we're going to manage that process, but get that engagement with the student, because one of the key elements I think that's going to be essential as part of the education process is to encourage and engage the students so they understand what are going to be the key elements of the industry as we move forward. And a lot of that is for the industry to regain its vibrancy, its strength, and to move forward has got to be in the area of building confidence and trust. How do we build confidence and trust in our future consumers? But from our point of view, how do we build that confidence and trust with the student, that we're engaging with them appropriately and we're giving them the skill sets that they're going to need to have a positive and career in the industry? And that's going to be, building that confidence and trust is going to be a key element of what we do and how we do it. And that, as I said, has got to be a whole variety of different tools and techniques. It's not just putting material online and telling them to go and look at it and come back again. We've got to think much more creatively than that. So if I'm being as provocative as I can be, I would suggest that one of the things you probably need to do is to throw your existing curriculum away and start again. Now, many of you are going to be going, whoa, hang on, I can't do that. I've invested years in this. I've got all of my material ready for my lectures next time. I've got all my existing material available online already. What are you telling me that I've got to throw it away and start again? I'm asking you to rethink through how much of what you've got there is relevant, how much of that you've got there is relevant for the future. How are you going to contextualize that material to make sure it is relevant for the future? And those are big asks, but they've got to be done. Otherwise, you're never going to build that confidence and trust and that level of engagement with students that you're going to need. So I think this creates huge new opportunities for a complete reset to hospitality, education and thinking. But the real cruncher for all of us is going to be, how do we blend a whole variety of different tools and techniques to engage with our students in a non-face-to-face environment? And then how do we engage with them in terms of developing their professional skills in an operational context? Because that's still going to need to happen. We're still going to need to be able to be in a position to provide instruction for the chefs, if you like, for all of the operational staff. And in fact, I would even argue that you need to invest more time in developing their practical, vocational and professional skills in the future than you did in the past, because the operational context is going to be completely different. So you've got to actually advise them in terms of what the future of that operational context is going to be. And that's a big ask as well, because you're not going to be able to get them all in at the same space at the same time and so on that you might have done before. So you've got to think through that process completely differently. So how are you going to engage with your students to give them those professional, practical sets of skills? And as I said, I would re-emphasize the point. I think you're going to need to give even more emphasis to developing those sets, because you're going to need those students to build their own confidence that they are going to be able to operate in whatever that future environment needs to be. They will only build their confidence and give them that confidence to take into the industry if they've had the opportunity not only of practicing it, but repeating it, and that they feel very confident in handling a very different operational environment than the one that they would have done 6 months ago. So how do we achieve all those things? So really it's about blending the online space and everything that one does within that online space, blending it with an enhanced professional skills development set. Both of those have got to go in tandem and hand in hand. And I think those are the key components about how you might think about completely rethinking through and re-engineering your curriculum. The only other point I'd make is from an educator's point of view, actually moving things into an online environment is not easy. And I know that you've done an awful lot of work in that field. But what you will have also noticed is it's extremely time consuming. That you really have to think through again how you're going to, what the relationship is between the educator and the student, because it's no longer a face-to-face relationship. You can't rely on that sort of relationship. So you've got to work out, how am I going to not only engage with them, but what's the nature of that relationship? And you're also going to have to put in some fairly strict guidelines as to how that's going to work. Now, I can give you some suggestions in terms of that sort of, if you like, the digital engagement, if you want to call it that. I run a very small training centre for adults with learning disabilities, in addition to many other things. And what we've had to do is to do exactly the same things as I'm talking to you about, because clearly we couldn't bring them in, and the only training that we were giving them before was actually entirely face-to-face. So we had to do exactly the same as you, to move things into a digital platforms, to move things in such a way to keep that level of engagement, to try and maintain wherever we possibly can, not only a degree of engagement, but a degree of carrying on with their education. And we've had to do that in a whole variety of ways, because our trainees, as we would refer to them, of course, they have learning difficulties. They're all adults. So actually, it's a harder task in many respects, because the degree of engagement has to be that much greater. You can't rely on them or assume that they will be able to engage directly for themselves. So we've done it in a number of ways that you might want to think about. First of all, we created their own website. So they have their own website now. They're not using our website, they use their own website. We created it, but we give them free access and they use it for whatever they want to do. So they post material on it, they use it as a blog, they use it as their own discussion forum. So it's not controlled by us, it's actually controlled by them. That gives them a degree of engagement and a degree of, if you like, ownership of that whole process. The second thing that we've done is we use Zoom sessions, and we use Zoom sessions with trainees on the basis of not one-to-one, but small group sessions of 1 to 10. We do those 3 times a week, and they're timetabled, so that you've got somebody who can actually physically see and engage with them in Zoom sessions, but we use them as seminars. So, or the idea behind seminars or workshops or just discussion forums. So we post things, perhaps a video, and then we use that video as the basis of that further discussion. We've created their own Facebook pages, we've created their own WhatsApp groups. we've given them so many different types of digital tools that they're now beginning to engage with. Now, why have we set about by doing those things? Not just in terms of the engagement, but to try and, if you like, simulate as far as we possibly can this notion of informal learning. A lot of, as you will know, students actually learn from each other. There's a lot of huge amount of informal learning which takes place interactively, either in the classroom, in the practical sessions and so on. If they're not in a position where they can actually converse, talk to each other, share ideas and so on, physically face to face, you've got to try and replicate the opportunities for those things to happen in that digital space. And that's quite hard, but you've got to use all those social media tools to be able to do that as well. So when you're talking about blended learning, I'm not just talking about putting things onto an online platform and saying, right, that's lesson 3, off you go, work your way through it. There will then be an online assessment or whatever that might happen to be. You've got to do that anyway, but you've also got to supplement that with as many other engaging activities as you can. So, for example, you should be using quizzes perhaps a lot more interactively than you may have done in the past. Think about how you might be using a whole raft of different survey tools. What other online resources are there available to you, or online interactive resources that you can begin to share so the students can get that informal learning going on between themselves? What there is create Zoom sessions which you're not monitoring so the students can actually have that conversation between themselves. Set up small group activities. So again, the students can be working together, but using a platform such as Zoom in order to be able to achieve that. Use WhatsApp quite extensively. Set up separate WhatsApp groups for different student groups, so they've got that degree of interaction amongst themselves within their own WhatsApp group. Set up your own, as many as you want really, but your own student forum websites. Make them independent from you so that they don't feel that you're actually controlling them or overseeing them in some way. What we found from that is actually that's been a very powerful tool, because they actually like the notion of being in control of something, that they feel that they can learn more from not learn more from each other, but they're learning from each other in the way that that's actually working. And the last thing I'll finish on this point, is think through how you're going to run those practical professional sessions, and think that through in a way that allows a degree of interaction between trainees. And you might need to put those trainees into separate, smaller groups, but that degree of interaction between the staff and the student, there you have that opportunity for that face-to-face at a distance, but you're going to have to think through that very carefully. But you're almost going to have to reverse engineer it by thinking, well, what is the industry going to need at the end of this process? And how do I develop the confidence in the students that actually what we're doing is what the industry will want when they finish their program? So I think I'll stop at that point, and then I'm more than happy to take any questions or comments or observations that anybody may have, or to enter into a detailed discussion.
Good afternoon, Professor Jones. I'm Rupa. I'm the moderator for this session. Nobody's posted any questions yet, so perhaps I would like to start.
Are they all shell-shocked?
I think so. No, I think they're just
stunned into
like
absolute
students.
Silence.
I think they're being like students today. Perhaps I could start with a question. We're told, we know already that the delivery of online teaching is very different to face-to-face teaching. Most of us have many years of experience of face-to-face teaching where we have this. What are the suggestions that you have for actually, or what are the kind of tools that we should use when we're making or structuring our course material for online teaching? What are the differences between teaching face-to-face and teaching online, as you know, as far as it goes from the beginning now?
Well, it's that degree of feedback. That's the immediacy of feedback. It's actually you can if you're using things like Zoom, but you can't, if you like, gauge what's going on in the classroom. I mean, most of us will know and understand when you are working in a class environment, whether I'm doing a lecture for 500 or whether I'm actually doing a seminar for 10, I get a sense, don't I, because of the presence of those students, of whether is what I'm talking about going in, is it relevant, am I engaging with them, or are they all falling asleep on me? So you know whether that interaction is taking place. So you change your style accordingly, don't you? You'll do something which will then engage with them. The difficulty you have is how do you translate that into an online or digital space? And you can't immediately, you can't easily. But what you've got to do is restructure what you're doing. So that might be that you give them something to do and you schedule a particular activity and you say to them, okay, right, I want you to do this at this particular time. And then you come in onto some sort of, if you like, Zoom session in small group activities where you then get that degree of reinforcement. Did they actually do that material? And you can check that easily enough. Have they engaged with that material? Have they been online? Have they actually done what I've asked them to do? And then you got the reinforcement of that through some sort of, if you like, Zoom platform or whatever other way you want to use, where you know that you can engage with that limited number of students. So you can replicate online big lectures easily enough. The harder part is that small group activity where you're getting that degree of reinforcement and activity going on. And I think you have to learn how to supplement a lot of this by getting that feedback through things like short quizzes, through short interactions with them, rather than you would do normally. So one thing I see changing quite significantly is that if you were in a higher education environment, you might have 2 pieces of assessed piece of work over a module, for example. I think you're now going to have to look at 10 or more little interactions which give you confirmation that the assessment is working and they are actually engaging and they're actually learning from that, if you like. So the nature of the way that you do that might just be through, as I said, online assessments, very short, pertinent, use as many different tools of online assessment as you can, drag and drop, video, filling in boxes. There's hundreds of different forms out there. And I think you need to explore and to think about what's most relevant for that particular group of students at that particular stage within their education process. But I think those things are going to have to change. And again, it's about engaging. If you've got 10 little assessments as opposed to 1 at the end, I think we all know, we've been in the game long enough to realize that for a lot of students, in terms of going through a module, they're only really interested in the assessment at the end. Because that's, for them, that's the only thing that really counts. Okay, am I going to pass that? What is it? If you've got lots of little ones and they've got to complete all of them, you've got much more chance of engaging with them through the whole of the process than you ever have by giving them a big assessment at the end and saying, okay, there you go, there's the assessment. Because they won't engage with the rest of the activity. And therefore, they're going to lose out hugely a lot on the peer-to-peer type of learning that's going on, the informal structure to the learning and so on. Yes. And don't be afraid of using other people's material is the other thing I would suggest. You know, there's a huge amount of stuff out there. I mean, I noticed we're live on YouTube at the moment, but I mean, there's been huge amounts of material that's around that you can begin to draw upon. And some of it you don't have to look at it and say, that's brilliant, I'll use it because it's brilliant. Sometimes you look at material and you say, I'm going to use that because it's rubbish. Actually, that's a brilliant piece of teaching material for me, because then I've got lots of things I can take apart and then put together in a different format for that particular group of students.
Okay, thank you. I'll just start asking questions. A number of questions have come up from IHM Bangalore. The question is, how reliable is assessment in online environments, and what measures are taken out to guard against cheating? That's what it says. Yes.
This has been an issue since probably about 1932. If you go back and you look in history, some of the first distance learning courses were actually even before then. And that's always been an issue. So how do I know that the person who's doing that assessment is actually the person who is purported to do the assessment? So how do I stop them cheating? Well, to some extent, you've got to have an element of trust, but there's also a number of things that you can put in place to do that as well. So for example, it's only an example, for some institutions on some online spaces, what they do is that they will send a text message to that candidate with a password. So when you're doing an online assessment, there's a unique password and it's timed that would be sent as a text message. They have to put that in to that particular piece of assessment. So at least you've got something. You could argue, oh, well, they might be sitting next to somebody else and therefore somebody else is feeding them the answers and so on. I'm afraid there's no simple solution to that unless you're going to go in for facial recognition or thumbprints or something. There is no simple solution. You've got to work on the basis of your own judgment, because let's face it, if you give them a piece of written work to be done, and then when they hand that piece of written work in, what do you do as a teacher? You look at it and you say, hang on, that doesn't look like the student I know. So what do I do about it? I then investigate it a little bit further. And then in many cases, you might say, well, they're obviously plagiarized whole chunks of this stuff. So you're doing that anyway. You've just got to be a bit smarter in the way that you might use different types of tools, and don't use the same one every time either, to actually try and ensure that you've got the right person at the other end of that particular assessment. But there are ways of doing it. Don't overcomplicate it, though, I would suggest. Don't go for highly complex technological solutions to actually what in reality is a fairly straightforward little problem, because most staff will look at a piece of, whether it's the responses to answers, whether it's a piece of written text or whatever it might happen to be, they'll look at that and they'll know, because of their discussions with students and so on, whether or not, is that about right? Does that seem right for that particular student or not? You've got to use your own professional judgment in the way that you do now.
Okay, the next question is from Chef Sanjay Kak. He's asking, how would you suggest we leverage the student-to-student learning as an educator?
I think you can only do that by actually encouraging them. And if I come back to some examples of the things that we've been quite successful at, I think, albeit on a very small scale, I recognise that, and that's the WhatsApp groups. And some of the things that we've done there is, and the use of their own online, their own website. So, for example, our trainees will, today is World Food Day, so they will be making their own cupcakes or whatever at home. What they then do is they post a picture of their own cupcakes, which goes on WhatsApp, and then they'll put the recipe onto, or not all of them, but they'll put the recipe and make it available on their own website. So that can be shared amongst the other trainees. And they take great delight in this notion of this sort of social degree of interaction, of showing off, actually, if you like, saying, oh, look what I've done. Now, I know that that's not immediately available to everybody, but it's the sort of thing that you need to encourage, because then they start to have conversations amongst each other. And what we've noticed is that they're using WhatsApp, either WhatsApp calls as video calls, audio calls, WhatsApp messaging, actually to communicate between each other on, and some of it will just be silly things. And I would suggest that you might want to try at the beginning to run a series of, if you like, silly things, which could be fun quizzes, okay? Well, they could be food related, but they're not part of a formal assessment, but it's just a bit of fun. And what you're getting them to do again is to interact with you and to interact with each other, and doing that. And we've done that, and we give the ones that get 100%, we send them a little silly certificate that says, well done, you got 100% in today's silly quiz, or whatever it might happen to be. And it's that sort of degree of engagement that actually makes them feel that they belong. It gives them a sense of confidence that we're here for them. And in the end, we get that degree of trust from them as well. So you've got to really, as I said earlier, I think you've got to think. Somebody said on a webinar I was doing yesterday, it's not just thinking out the box, it's actually just getting rid of that box because you need a new box now. So just think about these things in a hugely different way, and don't be afraid of making a fool of yourself either. You might think, oh, I'm a teacher, you know, I've got this particularly important position. Yes, but your role is to engage with your students. And if engaging with your students is by having some fun, because in the classroom you often would have a piece of fun, wouldn't you? You try and bring some levity into it, an element of humor, you try and make elements of it. Just try and do the same sort of thing, but just you've got to use the digital space to do it.
Okay. The next question is, how are students going to take this revolutionary change? I think this applies to students all over the world now.
It does.
And you know, in all age groups, whether they're mature adults or school children.
Yeah, it's exactly the same. And I've been amazed at how well some of them have actually adopted to it. And interestingly enough, the biggest pushback that I've witnessed is actually in the university sector at the moment. And that's because I suspect that, one, they're paying for it. And they see that, I mean, a lot of these discussions that I've had with people in higher education is the fact that they're concerned that students are asking for money back because they're saying, you know, oh, I'm not there anymore, I don't get the same experience, and therefore I want some money back. And to some extent, I can understand that. And that might mean that we have to rethink through the whole of the economic model in the way that we deliver these courses in the future. But that's not an issue for today. That's another issue altogether. But what I have been amazed by is how I've seen, both in the online space and in other areas, even with primary schools all the way through, is how many of them have adopted to this in a different way. And they are much more adventurous, perhaps, than we give them credit for. And that's why I keep coming back to the examples of dealing with a small group, but adult trainees with learning difficulties. Because if you can get that degree of engagement with people who throughout their entire lives have always found it difficult to learn, that's why they're called adults with learning difficulties, there's a whole raft of things which they now have become much more confident and familiar with, and are beginning to use and engage with in a very, very different way from what I would have predicted right at the beginning of the pandemic. And I think there is an issue there, and I understand what the issue is, but you just got to try as many of these things as you possibly can.
Okay.
Don't be afraid of having a go at something and making a fool of yourself.
The next question is it advisable to take online exams under the camera or without?
I'm not sure, quite frankly. It's not something I would look at. I think if you're going to do what you can do, and I think will work quite well, is if you've got if you're going to do practical sessions, then I think then there is a role for that. So, for example, many colleges and so on they've got TV setups and so on, where you're watching what's going on in the kitchen in a different place. If you wanted to do that, then I don't see a problem with that, because that's actually a good way, and that's a good way of playing that back so that the students actually learning from that experience, where did it go right, where did it go wrong, and so on. I don't think the notion of doing online exams with cameras is particularly valuable personally.
Okay, I'll move on to the next question. Lots of forums can also be a platform for the spread of incorrect information and rumors. How do you control that, especially for the age groups of students that we deal with?
The only way we control that is that we put in guidelines to actually try and ensure that that doesn't happen. So, for example, on our WhatsApp groups, we will look at that in the context of any fake news that might be there. On their Facebook page, we would do much the same sort of thing. So I think you've got to be a little measured about how you do that. And you do have to try and ensure, in the same way as all of those social media platforms are trying to police the same sort of stuff at the same time. It's not easy. Nobody's saying it is, but I think you've just got to be aware that there is a danger for it happening. If you see it, you've got to try and get rid of it and get it out of circulation as quickly as you can. If you can identify who's been responsible for it, then obviously you can do something about it.
We have another question. How do we go about the online teaching in courses which have so much of a practical content, such as hospitality, where you've said that, we need to make them ready for the industry. The industry is all practical. So, how does the online component figure in there? Well,
the online component is, if you like, is the understanding. What you're trying to do with the online component is to give them a degree of understanding about what's going on. What you then need to do is blend it with the practical experience so that they actually, and that's where those two things need to come together. So to some extent, you can do things with using videos or video clips to say, right, in these circumstances, look, watch, observe what is actually taking place here. What is the nature of that interaction? You use those as the basis of an online discussion. And then you've got to show how you put it into practice. But I'll come back to the point I made earlier. I think you need to spend and invest more time with students in an operational, practical context than you have in the past. And you supplement that with your online space. You don't try and replace it with an online space because it's not going to work. And you've then got to think through very, very carefully, how am I going to provide that practical experience which is relevant to those students in terms of the industry and the context for the industry. So, and you've got to think, and of course you might have some physical constraints on the number of students that you can get into that space at any one given time. So you have to think that through differently. How am I going to do that in the future? And it might be that you will need to utilize your practical facilities more than you are at the moment, but with fewer people in it at any one time. Mm-hmm. And that's only a reflection of what the industry is facing at the moment anyway.
Right. The next question, what would be the most effective way of assessing the learning outcomes? But I presume the learning outcomes will also change because the demands of the industry will have changed also.
Yeah, but it comes back to my point about, rethinking through your curriculum. If you're rethinking through your curriculum and you're re-engineering your curriculum, you're going to have to change your learning outcomes, aren't you? But I agree that there is the whole point about assessment is to assess the determined learning outcomes. It's no good just coming up with a piece of assessment at the end of that or a whole raft of assessments that doesn't have any relationship to what you want the students to be able to demonstrate they can physically and intellectually do at the end of the course. That's what the learning outcomes are all about. So you've got to really think through and say, well, how are all those learning outcomes? Are they going to be relevant? Do I need to rethink those? What's going to be the best sets of outcomes that my course is going to achieve? And then you've got to produce your assessment or assessments, probably many of them, to say they all have some relationship, and at the end I can feel confident that the outcomes that I've established have actually been met. And that's what the whole process of assessment's all about.
Okay, I'll move on to the next question. How do we fight the digital fatigue with the students and teachers through the sessions that are being organized on a continuous basis?
I think your biggest problem is actually the fatigue of your teachers, not your students. Because we know, and you will have already experienced this, that actually working in that online space now is a lot more time consuming and you can't easily walk away from it. And I'll give you some examples of that and what you might be able to do about it. When I was teaching, I was teaching an online master's program. And one of the things I noted on that master's program was that the majority of my students didn't post their pieces of work or their updates probably until somewhere later on in the evening or sometimes early in the morning. And when I started to look at why, what I discovered, of course, was that they were engaged in lots more of other things.
Excuse me, sir.
But what you have to do, I think, in terms of, is you have to be fairly firm in your guidelines about when you are going to respond. So from a member of staff's point of view, it's knowing when your, if you like, your digital office is going to be open for them. When are you going to interact with them? So that you don't become fatigued yourself because you are spending so much time online responding to students. So you need to think through the measures of doing that. Some of that could be by creating Zoom seminars and not responding to a variety of different emails. You've got to think about it differently.
For interactive sessions, as discussed, do you think WhatsApp groups are better or are Zoom groups better? Or
doesn't make any difference. Whatever seems to work best for you and those students. Doesn't matter. I would use as many different tools as you can because that helps to stop that, what you refer to as that sort of digital fatigue. But also please bear in mind that your students don't suffer from digital fatigue in the same way as you do. If you think about it, how long, if you look at their screen time, their average screen time, probably on their smart devices during the course of a day, what do you think the average student screen time is going to be during the course of a day? How many hours do you reckon?
Many hours.
Many, 16, 17 hours a day. So just be aware that their digital fatigue is not the same as the staff's digital fatigue. But and they're not going to spend 16 hours actually on your work, but they might spend 3 hours on your work because they're interspersing it with all the other things that they're currently doing on their devices anyway. So that's what you've got to think about. How are you actually doing and how you're achieving that? And some of that might be that you do, I would timetable things as well in much the same way as you do now. Don't assume that you put it all online. You've got a timetable. You've got to have a structure for some of that stuff. Mm-hmm. So some of those like Zoom or WhatsApp, however you want to do it, where you've got engaged with seminar groups, they might be 40-minute sessions or so on. Just think about what you're doing within those sessions, timetable them. When you finish that session, give them a piece of work to do. A short quiz might be read this, look at this video, then we set a quiz to it. And that quiz will have a finite end date to it as well. So it might be in 2 days' time at 12 o'clock lunchtime, that stops. You've got to have finished it by then, and so on. So you're giving them a structure to their learning as well. You're not just letting them loose in the big wild west and saying, you've got to do this, it's all online, off you go. Give it structure.
Okay, so one of the questions actually is, how could we make our online classes more interactive, unique and interesting? I think you've just answered that question.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay. Should a teacher regulate the relevant content over the internet for the students or let them explore what is most relevant? Should our guidelines be very kind of rigid or should we be a little more flexible?
I think you need to be as flexible as you possibly feel is relevant. And I think you need to get them to start to curate material. So one thing that certainly I've done in the past that's worked extremely well is one of the things that you're doing in one of these types of sessions will be to say to students, okay, look, right, what do we know? What's going on in the world at the moment that might be about different approaches to food and beverage service, for example? So what constraints are we noticing that's happening where it might be in New Zealand, in France or whatever? They've got the world at their fingertips anyway. You get them to start to curate material that's relevant to you as well. So don't you try and go out there and do it. Get them to bring that material back. Then they can share that material. They can share it with you. They can share it with the group. If you think that it's particularly relevant material, then you can post that on another resources platform so everybody can go and look at it. Just point them in the direction. But if you get them to find material and curate it, which is what I refer to it as, don't edit it, but just curate it. So they look at it and they say, well, I think that's relevant, actually. That would be good. I'll bring that back. Then you share that curated material that they themselves have been out there to explore and find. You can also make that actually part of an assessment if you wanted to as well, if you think about it.
What do you mean by curation? What is the kind of...
They've got to have reviewed it. It's no good just going out there and finding something and saying, oh, okay, I'll chuck that in. In other words, what they've got to do is they've got to look at it and say, how relevant is this? And then explain why it's relevant. What is its relevance to the question that you've asked? How does it add to the body of knowledge, if you like? How is it contributing to the overall? And that's what I mean by the curation side of it. It's looking at it in the same way as a museum curator would, looking at an artifact saying, how does that work? How relevant is it? Is it actually helping? Is it improving our overall understanding? And then bringing it back and putting it into a repository, call it what you like, then that can be shared. But they've got to know why it's relevant and be able to explain it.
So that makes them more accountable also and more responsible.
Of course it does, but it engages them. It's all part of that process of engagement.
Yeah. The next question, in terms of hospitality education online, what would be the most ideal pedagogy and how do we outline student learning outcomes? Considering the fact that a lot of hospitality education is hands-on practicals, how feasible is that on online work from home learning platform?
Well, I think I tried to already answer that in a way. There is no set pedagogy that's going to work online. That's why I keep making the point. It's really up to you guys to think through what's going to work for you. Let me just pose a number of questions. If you were in a face-to-face environment, every single teacher goes into that classroom and they have a different approach to the way that they're going to deliver that material. So you give me your material and say, right, please go and deliver it into that classroom. I'll go in there with that material. I feel confident with the material, but I'm going to do it very differently from the way that you did it. And the online space is no different. It's got to be a reflection of you as a person, but what you are trying to achieve in terms of that engagement with your students. So there is no set standard approach to this. And I think if you try and make one, then you're actually not going to help yourselves at all, actually. So you've got to think about it. And that's why I say part of all I'm trying to do today is to get you to think through how you're going to achieve these things. Now, could you just repeat the second part of the question, please?
Yes, I'll just go back to that. Considering the fact that a lot of hospitality education is hands-on practicals, how feasible is that on an online platform, especially when students are at home?
It's not, is the brief answer to that. And I've tried to emphasize that you've got to, it's got to be a blend between the professional, the professional skills development and the underlying understanding. And it's actually disaggregating those two bits to some extent. So when you're talking about that, how relevant is it at home, for example, Some of that you could probably do if you really thought about it. But again, it depends on the circumstances of the student, which makes it a little bit more complicated. But part of what I'm suggesting is that you've got to look at a wider range of resource tools that you can get them to investigate at home. So, for example, it could be just a series of video clips on, I don't know, different types of fish preparation, for example. Then what you get them to do, so they've already seen the video clips, they've seen the demonstrations. When you bring them into the professional environment, you say, well, you've seen those videos. That's what you saw there. What did you learn from that? Now, can you show me now, practically, what you learned from that video? You've never done it before necessarily, but now, what did the video tell you that you needed to pick up from? So have you actually used the video? Have you engaged with it? Have you used it in such a way that it's improved your understanding, which is what we want it to do? Now we've got to get you to practice the skill sets that the video's given you some understanding on. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes, I think it does. The next question is, what is the reliability of online assessments?
Well, I think I've already answered that. It's no more or less reliable than the assessments that you're doing now.
Okay, a slightly different question. We've been talking about students. The next question says, how do we measure the quality of teaching?
The same way as you do now, by the reaction that you get from the students, from the nature of the degree of engagement, from the, if you like, the nature of the outcomes. It's no different from what you're doing now, except, of course, that you're using completely different delivery mechanisms, perhaps in terms of achieving that. But how do you do it now? How do you assess the quality of the teaching now? I mean, I'm asking you that question now. So if somebody
Yes.
can tell me how you do it now, I'll tell you how you do it in an online space.
Easiest way to answer is the student feedback. They don't do anything.
So we take student feedback, we do peer-to-peer observation, we do teaching observations. These are the way we look, and we'll do module feedback.
Okay, so
yeah.
what's different? What's going to be different?
So you do, yeah, so that answers that question, I think.
Yeah, because you can invite people to come into your Zoom sessions, can't you? What's that, teaching observation?
Yes.
So that's part of that peer-to-peer thing. You get student feedback. You'll be doing exactly the same things. I don't see any difference, quite frankly. It's all about engagement. It's all about the degree of engagement. When you're doing peer-to-peer observations, when you're doing teaching observations, what are you looking for? You're looking at how well is that member of staff engaging with those students. What you're doing in this space is exactly the same. Okay.
Another question. The classroom teaching has several factors which complements learning atmosphere. How is it clearly missing in virtual sessions, and how to manage virtual learning without these stimuli?
You can still provide those stimuli, but you have to think about doing it in a different way. I understand where the question is coming from, because you do use different types of stimuli when you're in that classroom setting. But if you think about it, if you're doing things like Zoom group work or workshops or seminars or whatever you want to call them, if you could still bring different types of stimuli in. The problem you have with that is that you don't get that sort of immediate empathetic feedback that you would get in a face-to-face session. So it is different, I recognize that, but you can still bring things in. And in fact, in many ways, you've got a whole world out there. If you think about what you might be doing in a classroom, so you've got PowerPoints, you've got videos, you've got whiteboards, you've got whatever, you've got exactly the same tools available to you now. just in a different way. But you have to learn how to use them in that different way. And I think you have to be smart in terms of how you bring different things in at different stages during sessions and so on. Because again, it's thinking that through. And again, I'll come back to the point I kept making right from the very outset. You have to rethink that. Don't assume that what I did before, so here is my lesson plan for this lesson. All I'm going to do now is translate that into an online format, or actually do it through Zoom. You have to go right back to first principles and start to think it through again, right from the very beginning.
A number of similar questions have asked whether you can give some specific examples of tools or websites which can be used within an online situation.
The world, Google, it's called.
So anything which you feel is going to help the student enhance his knowledge and take him towards that learning outcome is going to be usable.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. And there's a huge amount of stuff out there. That's why I come back to my point about getting the students to curate some of that stuff for you. They're probably much better at finding some of that stuff than you will be. So give them that job to do, give them that task to do, give them that activity to do, to find out what is the most relevant sources. And that's not Wikipedia, but there's a huge amount of other stuff out there that they could begin to use. So I wouldn't try and put any boundaries around that. I think that's why that helps then that degree of engagement, by getting them to actually feel that they're part of that process and to make a significant contribution to it. And that's what I refer to as this idea of them as curators of material.
A couple of people have asked, is there any difference between live online classes and recorded online classes as far as student engagement is concerned?
Yep, live online classes are much, in my opinion, are much more preferable, because you do get a sense of interaction. You can ask them questions, you can ask them to respond directly in exactly the same way as you can in a classroom.
I think that's, is there a, no, I think we've more or less gone through the questions. There were a number of similar questions, so you've given us the answers to those. So I think we've actually gone through quite a wide range of things, and I think what you've so aptly said is rethink, re-engineer, and reset. That is something that we need to engage in on a very kind of on a war footing, because as soon as the industry and everything starts picking up, we need to be there with our with our students and what they're going to be doing, whether they need to be industry ready for that.
Yeah. And just as a final piece of advice, I would suggest that you need to be scanning the environment of what's going on in the industry, not just in one country, but in all over the world. And find out, well, how are these different parts of the industry reacting? Because your students will want that, they still see, I'm sure, ultimately that the world is their opportunity. So it shouldn't just be confined to one set of country examples. Look for examples of what's going on all over. But also, it's this whole notion, for me anyways, about understanding the world that they're going to go into. It's not going to be the same world as the world that we had. And the huge differences are not only the health and well-being issues, but are also going to be the way that the consumer, what is the consumer looking for in terms of this experience, this hospitality experience? So it's trying to get, from a teacher's point of view, an understanding of the context in which I'm putting my material. And if that context is, well, there's a whole raft of health and well-being issues that need to be addressed, for example, we've got to make sure we understand all of those and we're addressing all those. But the one that's harder to understand is what is the consumer going to be thinking about these things? How is that consumer, that guest, that whatever you want to call them, how are they going to be responding to the world outside? And I suggest that we need to think very carefully about how is that consumer behavior going to change. Many of the precepts that we've had before in terms of things like marketing, branding, a lot of that's going to have to change. Because one, there won't be quite so much of it available, but also the other I think is that public sentiment has actually changed hugely. And so their value sets, consumers' values have changed hugely. And it's understanding what those future values are likely to be. And are their values entirely about what the latest trends might be, or have they gone back to some more fundamental values of safety, security, and so on? If you, for fear of teaching teachers, which I never like to do, just think about Maslow's hierarchy of needs and think about where the consumers might be now and where they might be as time progresses. Because what you've got to do is you've got to set your teaching into the context of where Maslow's hierarchy would suggest the consumers might be. And at the moment, their needs are security. We're a long way away from self-actualization, which is where we were before this whole thing started. So think about the consumer as being, what I've got to do is give my students an understanding of how we're going to help the consumer to build confidence and trust in the industry, and how over time they're going to move away from purely their security and safety needs to much more of that self-actualization. And that's going to be a fairly long journey, I suggest.
So may I suggest that you're kind of saying that we have to start from the beginning again, and this is the opportunity to actually take ourselves into a different world arena?
Absolutely right. And I think what we're doing, if we don't do that, we're missing a huge opportunity. Then we should be really ashamed of ourselves for not taking advantage of this opportunity. Now, it's been forced on us. We didn't look for it. We don't want it necessarily, but it's here. So why don't we use it to our best advantage? I think there are huge opportunities here for recasting, rethinking, re-engineering the way that we think about hospitality education and make it more relevant for the future than what we had before. On a not the same thing, but somebody said on a webinar I was doing yesterday that said, what we don't want to do is to go back to our old bad habits. And I think that was an interesting turn of phrase to use, that was suggesting that some of the things, if we think that all we're doing is doing what we used to do, but we're now doing it in a different way, is wrong. We've got to rethink the fundamentals of what we are actually doing.
Okay. I think as far as questions go, that was the last question. Just one more. How many hours in a day would be ideal to engage a student in online teaching? But I think you kind of answered that before, saying how long do they spend online and how much of that will they spend on the teaching? Yeah.
Well, just think through what you would expect them to do in the normal circumstances, and just don't have any greater expectations or any lesser expectations. If you said that we would normally expect them to engage with us for, I don't know, 15 hours a week, do the same thing. Why should it be any different?
Okay.
What's different is your mindset. That's the difference. It's getting you, and I'm saying to this generically, including myself in this, getting us, if you like, then to change our mindset about how we deal with that, because our mindset is all predicated on, I've got a timetable, I've got a classroom, people come in, I know what I'm doing in that time and in that space. What I'm saying to you is that what you've got to do is change your mindset, because your students will have changed their mindset. They won't necessarily structure it by all means, and make sure you've got a structure there. But don't assume that all the learning is going to take place in your online space. It's not. You've got to engage with them in a whole variety of ways. So this informal peer-to-peer learning is taking place at the same time as well. But you've also got to think through, actually, how am I going to change? Because if you don't change, they can't change. So the first part of that process is about thinking through, what do I need to do differently? How do I need to re-engineer my own thinking about how we're going to do this?
Okay, great.
And does that, I'm not sure any of it helps, but anyway.
Yeah,
I wasn't setting out to help, actually. I was setting out to challenge to some extent.
It has been very helpful. We've received a lot of inputs which are going to certainly make us all think. We all already started on this particular route, as Dr. Bose has mentioned, but I think the inputs that you've given us today will actually kind of speed that up and also enable us to think again. This idea that you've given about now working with Maslow's hierarchy, and now again we're at the bottom and we need to, you know, work our way up. That's a very interesting thing, which is a very practical application of the theory.
Yep.
Okay, so thank you very much. I would like to hand you over back to Dr. Bose. Thank you, Professor.
Yeah,
okay.
Thank you very much, Peter. That was absolutely very, very productive, and a lot of questions were answered, and I think a lot of thought process, and I think we all agree to what you say, that we need to change the mindset. And I had a session with all the faculty a couple of days back, and I spoke the exactly same thing. We need to think differently now, because the world is now going to be conducting itself in a very different way. And obviously that's exactly what you said is absolutely right. Interestingly, the CEO of the Taj Group of Hotel, a good friend of IIHM, Puneet Chhatwal, remarked a couple of days back that they didn't taught us in a business school what happens when your revenue falls from 85% occupancy to 0% in 7 days. So that's your new case study. I mean, no business school told you what happens in 7 days when you lose the business from a full hotel to 0% in all your 140 properties, and then you don't know what to do. No. So these are the new case studies we've been written all over the world, and I think we all are learning now. Your Maslow was an excellent example about the learning cycle, and back to the safety security factor first, and then possibly looking for anything more than that, and the self-actualization is quite far off right at this moment. So also we discussed with the faculty team on a couple of days back about the industry looking now for a more non-specialist young people, like all-rounders who can do right from F&B to the rooms division, to the marketing, to the housekeeping, rather than a specialist. I am a front office associate, because they will recruit less people, and they would like to have a lot of these people who can really handle a lot of stuff together. So these are the things which we need to really re-engineer and reimagine, and teach our students, so that they don't have the old mindset of specializing in a particular area anymore. You know.
Can I just? I would agree with you entirely, and I think that's why I would suggest that the whole issue about developing their professional competencies across the whole range of activities is particularly relevant and important, and that they've got to have that multi-skilling, multitasking ability, and be creative and flexible to be able to go into any area of operation. but they've got to be able to have the confidence to be able to work in any area of operation. And how do you build confidence? You build it through repetition, you build it through actually developing your skill sets so that you feel confident to actually go into that environment at the drop of a hat. And that's where I agree that I think the whole rethinking, recasting, moving away from areas of specialism perhaps is an important factor, and bringing the thing back to, if you like, to a reset. And we've got that opportunity to do that now.
Absolutely, absolutely amazing. And that's exactly the message. What a great way to conclude that. And on behalf of everyone, thank you very much, Peter, for your time and very, very valuable inputs. And if you have got more questions, I will possibly send you a couple of emails, only good questions, reputations. And thank you for being with us. I think everybody has been hugely benefited, and will take it forward to the next level. So to all the educators out here, thank you very much for being with us, and for all your great questions. I'm sure this session have demystified a lot of mystery of the online learning and teaching. I'm sure it will take some time, as Professor Jones said, that we are now pressing the reset button. So with that, thank you very much, Peter Jones, for your time and your all great advices. And we will be back to you in some time in the future once again. And thanks everybody out here. Have a great evening.
Okay, thank you very much indeed then.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay.